speaks of a time of great tribulation where God would unleash a judgment here on earth. It speaks of the heavens falling and the Son of Man coming in the clouds. But what does this mean? Today I would like to explore with you the true meaning of Matthew 24, known as the Olivet Discourse. We will uncover the Great Tribulation. First, we will find out when it happened. Secondly, what happened. And lastly, why it happened. So first of all, when it happened. There are two basic interpretations of the Olivet Discourse. The futurist approach, who believe this is all going to happen in the future, and that Jesus is prophesying about a future temple that will be rebuilt when Christ comes. The fulfilled approach sees most of the events of Matthew 24 as applying to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans. This is the view I hold to, and I hope to show you the truth of it in this speech. This is a very broad subject, and there is lots of information on it, so I will only be able to touch on a little of it. So to begin, let's look at the first verse of Matthew 24, which says, Jesus left the temple and was going away, when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, You see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. Unquote. We can see that Jesus and his disciples were looking at the temple they had just left, when Jesus says that it will be destroyed. The popular view, which is held by Tim LaHaye, the author of the Left Behind series, is that this is referring to a future temple that will be rebuilt before a tribulation period. Yet how can this be? Luke 21:5-6 says, quote, And while some were talking about the temple that was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be torn down. Unquote. The only clear interpretation of this would be the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Matthew 24:34 says, Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Exactly one generation after Jesus said this was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Roman army in 70 AD. Some people say this word generation means race, yet when we look at how many other times this same word is used in the New Testament, it never once refers to the race, but means contemporaries. People who say it means race even agree with this, yet they say the word changes its meanings in Matthew 24. Yet why would it suddenly change? I also wish to point out that this is not some new theory. This view was held by men like Augustine, Jerome, Thomas Newton, Charles Spurgeon, Hank Hanegraaff, and many more. We must therefore conclude that the events prophesied in Matthew 24 took place within the lifetime of the generation which was then living. Having said that, let's now go over a little bit of what happened in 70 AD. At the beginning of the Olivet Discourse, the disciples asked Jesus, When will these things be? Which we answered in my first point. They also asked, What will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Jesus answers their questions by giving them 7 signs of the end. But we must remember that this is not referring to the end of the world. The early church was living at the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of a new. For the sake of time, we will only be going over 4 of the 7 signs. The first sign in verse 4 of Matthew 24 is false Christ, which said, quote, See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Unquote. Jesus' warning came true. In those days, there were many who claimed to be the Messiah. Men like Simon Magus, a sorcerer who believed he was the creator. Theudas also led many astray, as did Jews of Galilee. It is clear that in the years shortly after Jesus spoke these words, there were many who came falsely claiming to be the Messiah, and were able to mislead many, as Jesus prophesied. The next sign in verse 7-8 is famines, which says, quote, And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginnings of birth pains. Unquote. Josephus, a first-century historian, wrote an account on what he witnessed during the siege. He was sort of a mediator between Rome and Jerusalem, and was one of the few who survived the siege. In his Jewish Wars, he recounts the details of the horrors of the siege. He says, quote, Now, unable to leave the city, the Jews lost all hope of survival. The famine had grown even worse, devouring family after family. Homes were filled with women and children thus destroyed, and alleys with corpses of old men. Young men and boys swelling with hunger haunted the marketplace and fell dead in their tracks. Unquote. This famine was so bad that people ate things that even an animal would not touch. Josephus also speaks of a woman who ate her own baby, Yet these are just the beginnings of the birth pains. The tribulation got far worse. The next sign in verse 9 is persecution, which says, quote, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by the nations on account of my name," unquote. In Acts, we can read of how much the early church suffered for their belief in Jesus as the Son of God. Stephen was stoned to death. Herod had James put to death by the sword. Paul was executed for his faith under Nero. Peter was crucified upside down. Philip, Simon, and Bartholomew were also crucified. Many other apostles and believers met with tortures and violent deaths during the same time period as prophesied by Jesus. The last sign, in verse 15 through 17, is the abomination of desolation, which says, quote, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, standing, which is prophesied by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," unquote. When Israel rejected Jesus and kept offering sacrifices, they were practicing idolatry. The sacrifices were no longer needed because Jesus died and fulfilled them. So when the Israelites kept sacrificing, the temple became an abomination to God. And when the Roman armies came in and set up their gods and altars and filled the temple with blood, Christians knew that Jesus' prophecy was untrue. Then the temple was destroyed. Not one stone was left upon another, and it became desolate. This was the abomination of desolation prophesied by Jesus, which marked the end of the Old Covenant era. This was the Great Tribulation. Now that we've discovered a little bit of what happened, we will now go over why it happened. Because of Israel's rejection of the King of Kings, the blessings they had received turned into curses. We can read in the New Testament of Jerusalem and its horrifying final stages, the loss of all ability to reason, the frenzied mobs attacking one another, the deluded multitudes following after false prophets, the crazed and desperate chase for food, the mass murderers, executions, and suicides. Josephus claims that over 1,100,000 people were killed, and over 97,000 were captured and enslaved. Nothing will compare to that of what happened in 70 AD. Why, you may ask? How could God let a beautiful and once holy city come to a place where blood filled the streets? After Titus returned from victory, he said there was, quote, "no merit in vanquishing people forsaken by their own God," unquote. Israel had turned away from the one true God and shouted, "Let him be crucified! Let him be crucified! His blood be on us and our children." Never did a generation provoke such an awful curse upon themselves as they did. And so Christ came against them in judgment, as he predicted in Matthew 24:29-30, which says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man coming on the clouds," unquote. Jesus seems to be saying that immediately after the tribulation will be his second coming. Did his second coming occur in 70 AD? To understand this, we must remember that Jesus spoke to a generation who understood the Old Testament imagery which he was using. In the Old Testament, the sun, moon, and stars are used to represent earthly authorities and governors. And when God threatens to come against them in judgment, this same collapsing universe terminology is used to describe it. We must let the Bible interpret itself. So let's go back to Isaiah 13, verse 9, which says, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and a burning anger, to make the land a desolation. He will exterminate the sinners from it, for the stars and their constellations will not flash forth their light." None of this actually happened literally, but they did as far as the wicked nations were concerned. So referring to Matthew 24, Jesus is speaking of a judgment on the house of Israel. Its light was going to be extinguished. The desolation of the old temple was the final sign that God had deserted it and was now dwelling in the new temple, the church. So in conclusion, we first saw when the Great Tribulation happened. We discovered that Jesus spoke to a generation living at the time. Secondly, we saw what happened. We went over some of the signs at the end and saw how they pointed to the destruction of Jerusalem. And lastly, we saw why it happened. That because of Israel's rejection of the one true king and their turning away from God, this judgment was brought upon them. I know that this brief summary may not be enough to convince anyone. My hope, though, is that I've succeeded in sparking an interest in this exciting and intriguing topic. I also hope that nobody will just settle for believing whatever they hear. We must search the scriptures daily and diligently, and always seek the truth. Thank you.
9:55.